We love telling the stories of worlds colliding, and this one is very peculiar. In the late 16th century, the Spanish Conquistadors encroaching into Asia under the orders of their king Philip II, and groups of Japanese Wokou pirates clashed over the Philippines and its riches at the Battle of Cagayan. In this video, we will cover this lesser-known battle and try to deduce the truth of it. Shout out to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Statistically, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of hair loss or male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. It happened to one of us, and although it's too late for him, it's not too late for you. He didn't act on time, but that shouldn't be the case for you, as Keeps allows you to get treated from home, and thanks to Keeps, you can avoid an awkward visit to the doctor, and your hair loss medication can be delivered to your home. Keeps offers generic versions of 2 FDA-approved hair loss products. You'll be surprised by the price. Remember, prevention is the key in these matters. Keeps treatments typically take between 4 to 6 months to see results, so it's important to act fast. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors. Hundreds of thousands of men trust Keeps for their hair loss prevention medication. And if you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/kings or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. On the 27th of April, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan, who was leading a Spanish expedition to circumnavigate the world, died in a clash with the natives of Mactan Island in the Philippines. Although he himself perished, his journey fundamentally changed the world, proving beyond any doubt that the Earth was round, and most crucially for our story, triggering Spain's interest in the West Pacific region. The Spanish adventurers who sailed to the Philippines wrote vivid descriptions of the riches of the islands. A letter dated in 1547 by Jerónimo de Santisteban recounts in detail how the island of Mindanao was truly a land of affluent wealth, producing gold and great amounts of ginger, sandalwood, rice, sago, palm, mirobalan, and animals like pork, and of course various kinds of exotic fruits. Accounts like that of Jerónimo excited the Spanish, who were in search of more riches, and 17 years later, Miguel López de Legazpi, under orders from King Philip II, sailed from New Spain and conquered the island of Cebu. Aside from the mythical treasures of the islands, there was another reason that pushed the Spanish towards the conquest of the islands. In the 16th century, the Philippines stood as an important trade node in East Asia, and both European and Chinese sources tell of a well-established maritime network that connected Japan, China, Thailand, Borneo, and Vietnam. With Spain establishing a foothold on the islands, Mexico was added to this trading network, further increasing its value and the volume of products that were shipped. Consequently, the abundant resources of the Philippine archipelago and the passing trading vessels attracted, other than the Spanish adventurers, another group of people that were after quick riches, the Wokou or Wokou pirates. Contrary to a common misconception, the pirates weren't solely Japanese, but came from miscellaneous groups of mixed ethnic origins, including Koreans, Chinese, Southeast Asians, and of course locals from every region the pirates were active in. Contemporary Ming officials give us further insight into the ethnic background of the Wokou. According to censor Du Zhonglu, 70% of the pirates hailed from the Fujian and Ningpo provinces in China, 20% were from Ryukyu, and the remaining 10% consisted of various barbarians. The fact that the majority of them came from China didn't stop them from continuously raiding Chinese coastal towns and villages, but successful suppression campaigns launched by the Ming in the mid-16th century forced more and more of the Wokou to seek refuge in the islands of the Philippines and move their piracy and trade-related operations there. Within 2 decades, trade in the area was flourishing. Chinese and Japanese merchants visited Mindoro and Luzon every year, exchanging silk, wood, bells, porcelain, perfume, tin, and cotton-made clothes for gold and beeswax. In northern Luzon, the Wokou established a pirate city-state, Apari. The pirates, naturally, did not limit their presence to Apari, and it soon became obvious that the island of Luzon was not big enough for both Spain and the Wokou, and in 1582, the European superpower would clash with a group of the merchant pirates. Details on this peculiar battle are given to us through two letters, one from priest Juan Baptista Roman to the Viceroy of Mexico, and the second from Gonzalo Rodrigo de Peñalosa, who was the governor of the Philippines to the King of Spain, Philip II. Both letters are second-hand accounts of the battle, and we can find some inaccuracies and exaggerations in them, so their content should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, they refer to the pirates as the Japanese, and although some and even maybe the leaders hailed from the land of the rising sun, as we've already mentioned, the majority of them were likely Chinese, and in this case local Filipinos. They also differ at some parts of the story, so overall we can't be certain as to how the conflict between the Spanish fleet and the pirates actually unfolded. In Juan Baptista's letter, we read that Juan Pablo de Cagayan, the admiral of the punitive expedition, set sail from the port of Vigan in Ilocos with a total of 7 ships, 1 galley which he was aboard, a smaller ship, the San Giuseppe, and 5 frigates, sailing to Cagayan, where the Wokou pirates had settled. As he was sailing, he encountered a Chinese pirate vessel, which soon after surrendered, and the Spanish placed 17 soldiers on board to guard it, and then continued their course. As the Spanish fleet was rounding the Cape of Boheador and nearing Cagayan, they encountered a Japanese vessel, and Juan Pablo engaged it with the galley. It is unclear what the rest of the Spanish fleet was doing at the time. Using the galley's artillery, the Spanish managed to destroy the main mast of the enemy ship, but then the pirates pulled out grappling irons and boarded San Giuseppe with 200 men armed with pikes and breastplates, whereas 60 Wokou arquebusiers remained aboard their ship and continued to shoot the Spanish soldiers and sailors. The pirates managed to push back the Spanish and conquered the galley until around the main mast. There, the Spanish resistance stiffened, forcing the Wokou to retreat to their ship, hastily dropping their grappling irons and setting their foresail in an attempt to escape. However, now it was the crew of San Giuseppe that grappled the opposing vessel. With artillery and forces boarding the Wokou ship, the Spanish overcame their adversaries, who fought valiantly until only 18 of them remained, who, exhausted from a fierce fight, gave themselves up. Amazingly enough, the Spanish didn't seem to suffer many casualties, as Juan Baptista wrote quite cynically that only some men on the galley perished. However, amongst the dead was the captain of the ship, Pero Lucas, who died fighting valiantly as a good soldier. Following this battle, the Spanish fleet ascended the Cagayan River and discovered there a fort built by the pirates and 11 of their ships. When San Giuseppe was entering the river, she encountered a smaller Spanish frigate. The soldiers of the frigate called out to Juan Pablo, urging him to return to Manila with the entire fleet, as there were around 1,000 Japanese on the river with a great deal of artillery, and they were thus outnumbered and outgunned. Hearing this, Captain Leas de Callejo redirected his course seaward. Juan Pablo, despite his attempts, could not enter further, and in the morning he anchored in a bay, where later on a storm struck the ship, breaking 3 of the 4 cables that he had and 1 used for weighing anchor. Juan Baptista proceeds to recount perhaps the most controversial part of the story, as it was told to him by 6 soldiers. The soldiers had been tasked with finding water, but failing to find any, they returned to where they had left their ship to find that missing as well. Then they met some Indians who were in the galley with Juan Pablo. From them, they were informed that Juan Pablo had ascended the river 2 leagues and fortified himself in a bay. Then Juan Baptista describes the heroic clash between the Spanish and the Wokou, though it seems it was wildly exaggerated. They said that the Japanese were attacking them with 18 champens, which are like skiffs. They were defending themselves well, although there were but 60 soldiers with the seamen, and there were 1,000 of the enemy, of a race at once valorous and skillful. Juan Baptista closes his letter to the Viceroy, asking for 1,000 men as reinforcements, and mentions that there are not enough men on the island to keep it under control. Another slightly different version of the battle comes to us from an unsigned source. According to this version, Juan Pablo, after sailing through the Wokou fleet without receiving any harm, made a fort out of the galley, in which he mounted his artillery as well as possible. The Japanese general wrote him a letter, in which he said that he knew well that they were robbers like himself, but that he was there first and had come at his king's command. Consequently, if Cagayan wished him to go away and leave him the river, he was to give him a large sum of gold. The Spanish responded that they would take away the Japanese gold and that they would drive them out of the country. As the attempt to negotiate proved to be futile, the pirates launched an assault at dawn with more than 600 men armed with muskets and other weapons. The Spanish were only 80, but well defended by their improvised fort, and managed to kill a great number of the attackers while losing only one soldier, and that is said to be by accident. Seeing that they couldn't overwhelm the well-defended Spanish position, the Japanese decided not only to retreat, but to abandon the island altogether and set sail for their homes. Finally, the author claims to have spoken with Father Francisco Cabal of the Society of Jesus, who had been in Japan and had talked with the pirates. Father Cabal recalls that when he talked with them, the Wokou were afraid of the Spaniards, and that they were astonished by the rapidity and skill with which the Spaniards fired their arquebuses. The governor of the islands, Peñalosa, in his letter to King Philip II, dated July 1st, recounts a different version of the story. For once, according to Peñalosa, the Chinese pirate ship, the governor considers it to be a Sangli, and the Japanese one, fought as allies against the Spanish fleet. It was the combined strength of these two vessels that numbered 200 pirates, but the Spanish prevailed after killing the chief and his son in the battle, whereas only 3 of the Spanish crew perished. Then Juan Pablo, the lieutenant general in charge of the fleet as we already know, continued his journey and entered the Cagayan River, where he was to make a settlement. At this point, however, the governor's story starts to differ greatly from the one told by Juan Baptista in his writings. For starters, Peñalosa mentions that upon entering the river, Juan Pablo sighted 6 Wokou ships that belonged to the fleet he had just defeated, not 11. As there were many men and fortifications, the admiral chose not to attempt to sack the forts as a previous storm had scattered the fleet, the flagship had been driven off to sea, and so Cagayan was low on manpower and firepower. He did, however, sail up the river for 6 more leagues, and there he made a settlement and erected a fort from which he could conduct offensive and defensive operations against the pirates. Peñalosa makes no mention of the heroic last stand of the 60 Spanish warriors against the 1,000 Japanese Juan Baptista speaks of, even though Peñalosa's letter is dated 6 days after Juan Baptista's. The governor of the islands then proceeds to inform Philip that he has already dispatched as much help as he could to Cagayan, including men, boats, ammunition and provisions. He states that his available forces are already spread thin, and complains that any help from New Spain hasn't been sent, although he has implored them to do so, and warns that the Chinese and Japanese are dangerous opponents and a serious threat, and asks for the king's aid, or the colony will not survive. Both sources do not inform us of the fate of Cagayan's expedition to oust the Wokou from the province of Cagayan. Juan Baptista's letter leads us to believe that the Spanish at least survived the initial onslaught, if not emerging totally victorious against the pirates. On the other hand, Peñalosa doesn't even mention a direct confrontation with the Wokou, while the fleet had reached Cagayan, ending his tale with the Spanish disembarking and building fortifications, and his decision to further reinforce the fleet. In the following year, 1583, a Spanish royal decree reorganized the entire northeastern portion of Luzon into one large political unit called La Provincia de Cagayan. From that and the steady colonization of the area, we can assume that the Spanish were eventually successful in their endeavor, either by using force or striking a deal with the pirates. In either case, the region would remain under firm Spanish control until the United States took over the Philippines in 1898. As for the Wokou, the strong Ming and Tokugawa regimes would eradicate them during the 17th century. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description, to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.